Welcome to More Tea Vicar with myself, James Stevenson, and you,
Wayne Massey.
It's feeling summery. You're in your shorts.
I'm in my shorts and a t-shirt. You're wearing jeans, and I think, I was just about to go. It looks like a jean, but it actually looks, as I'm close to it, it looks like it might not be a jean. If you're on the video,
please don't
if you're on the
touch me.
video, I am actually close
Please
to
don't
stroking
touch me.
James's knee to feel like
Anyway,
that denim.
It's Tuesday. The something 15th of January, 15th of July, 14th of July, 15th. Anyway. We're doing really well here.
14th, 15th,
Yeah.
15th. Yesterday was the 14th.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so welcome. We're going to talk today about something that happened a little while ago. So last week, when we did More Tea Vicar, we essentially did a conversation about sudden death because the previous weekend there'd been the deaths of the two footballers, Diogo Jota and Andre Silva, his brother, and then there'd been the Texan floods.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about what it meant for us to exist in places that we might find ourselves in the future as Christians where there's been a sudden death. And today we're going to talk about something that happened around that time. So it was just as the deaths happened in Spain, the two footballers. And it's Rachel Reeves, the Treasurer.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Chancellor, I haven't been on the whiskey this morning. Chancellor of the Exchequer and her being photographed as in tears during a debate in Parliament, and how that landed in the news. One of the things we noted was that it was good that we didn't do it right at the time, because in particular we didn't want to be kind of two men talking about a woman crying, because we think that would be a kind of, could be perceived to be could be heard through the wrong filter of how we're coming at this. So this isn't in any way a critique of her tears. Actually, it's a way to understand that and understand how we react to that, and the kind of why it causes the reaction it's caused. So we're not talking about her crying, we're talking about the reaction that it's caused and what that does in our culture and how we can respond to that as Christians. Wayne, over to you.
When I saw it, the reason I thought about talking about it was there were these two thoughts popped into my head. I don't know if we'll do both of these justice. The first thought was the power of image. Yeah. So you and I, we filmed this with a cross behind us, and about how images become icons. Yeah. And the idea of in faith as an icon is a thin. Is a thin membrane between something and another world, and it takes you somewhere else. And so we have these kind of very, very powerful images that become truth even if they're not truth. So the most famous, I think, early political kind of image of this is the Nixon-Kennedy debates in the 1960s were the first debates kind of that were heavily televised in the States. And if you listen to the debate on the radio, you overwhelmingly Richard Nixon beat Kennedy in the debate. But Nixon refused makeup and sweated profusely. And so if you watched on television, you thought that Kennedy won heavily because he looked young and he looked healthy, and Nixon looked sort of like, even in black and white, pale and sweaty. Yeah. And this idea that images sometimes convey something far more powerful. And so we have... You have, in recent years, Rishi Sunak going out to announce an election and it raining on him. You know, from the moment he's done that, everybody went, well, he's lost that election. You know, there's still 4 weeks to go. Or Ed Miliband, a few years later, do you remember eating a bacon sandwich? Or Theresa May, there was the one where all the letters fell off the signs from behind her. That actually these politicians, they have these images that end up defining who they are. So with Tony Blair, actually, it is him standing outside the church. So he's already won, but he's outside the church after Princess Diana dies, and makes this very powerful speech about the people's princess, and that creates an image early days in that Labour government. And so here's this image a year into this Labour government of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the second most powerful person in the cabinet, openly weeping on the front benches, and what does that image convey to the nation about government and about Sir Keir Starmer as well, and about authority. And then the second one is just how the press responded to it, and how in an age where we're supposed to be egalitarian and we're supposed to be beyond that, there was this kind of inference of, well, this isn't good, this is weakness.
Yeah.
And so therefore this is this further underscores this image of being like, actually she's now as a chancellor, she's kind of potentially slightly sunk, or she's not going to ever become prime minister because actually she's now got this, she's the woman who cries.
Yeah.
And how like we're supposed to be beyond that kind of way of judging people. And those were the two things that came up in my mind to think about.
So good. So this culture, it's culture, theology, and life. Those are the three kind of building blocks of this podcast. So tell us a little bit more about what's going on within culture around this specific instance. You've done a bit of it already, but in a bit more detail.
So we are in a culture where, and we'll get onto this, I think, a little bit later as well. But, Tom Holland, who wrote the book Dominion, talked about this. How one of the marks of Western culture, which he sees as a direct inheritor from the Christian tradition, is that the weak and the vulnerable and the victims are given power and voice that in most other cultures they never were. So,
So the welfare state,
yeah,
being the very bill that was being debated in the moment,
yeah,
which is
and
poignant.
how. And so one of the things, and I was in a meeting yesterday where we were talking about like a citywide event for churches in Bristol, and the younger people in the room, you would use words like authenticity and integrity,
Yeah.
and actually so we live in a culture that wants to be real and wants to be true and wants to be honest and open about its emotions,
Yeah.
But only to a point.
Yeah.
So as soon as self-expression doesn't suit us,
Yes.
we turn on it.
Yeah.
And actually, we probably are far more. Holland makes the point that he thought he was like an inheritor of the Roman and the Greek tradition, and then he realized the Romans and the Greeks just absolutely loved power and hated weak people and would just obliterate them. And that actually there's far more of us in our hearts that are kind of like Romans and Greeks around power than we realize. So, the most famous female politician in the history of the United Kingdom is Margaret Thatcher, who basically had to reinvent herself as a male-type character in order to lead.
Yeah.
And so when a woman exhibits what we might deem to be, and this might be wrong of me to say this because actually men weep as well, but when a woman exhibits what we think is like, feminine traits, we go, well, that's weakness.
Yes.
As opposed to going, well, what kind of pressure have you been under? Well, you've been basically, this bill that you said, this bill has to get through, and then it doesn't get through because of a massive rebellion.
Yeah.
And the emotions involved in that.
And presumably the vast amount of work and huge sacrifice that she will have made personally in order to get that bill to the point where it was.
So we want, but what we kind of think is we want our leaders to lead.
Yeah.
We want them to be strong, and then when things don't work out for them, they show an element of weakness. We turn on them.
Yeah. And let's just let's reverse it. So if you imagine where we're happy to see people weep, it would be, for example, in a audition for Britain's Got Talent, the person who gets the golden buzzer, I don't know if they still do that, but like who gets sent through to the final straight away.
I wouldn't know. Sorry, that's a joke. In little internal joke.
We're happy to see the person who's got the prize weep.
Are interesting enough in the same
a moment of joy.
In the same chamber, we are happy on an assisted dying bill for somebody not to be actually arguing with the technicalities of the bill, are arguing philosophically, but to be telling emotive stories to start weeping, and we think that's really rather valuable. But then when somebody weeps because they're at the end of probably 48 hours of solid work and all, they're watching their life's work go down the pan, we're like, oh, I don't like that.
I don't like that. Okay. So then what, immediately, you've got Jesus in tears written down here, shortest verse in the Bible.
Yeah, John chapter 11. He gets to his friend's grave and it just says Jesus wept. And Tom Holland's point, his thing is what Jesus brings. Tom Holland says is that the root to greatness lies in being weak, and that is not how the world has operated ever since the fall. But Holland says the root to greatness lies in weakness. St. Paul says, that Christ's power is made perfect in our weakness, and that there is this idea that actually that there is something about weakness. Through which the power of God flows, and through which the kingdom of God comes, and through which the world is transformed.
And this is the bit that is often missed, is that Jesus had disciples, and he had family, and he had friends. And the nature of the dynamic between him and his disciples was a rabbi and disciples, but he also had friends.
Yeah.
With whom he was friends. There's a line not in the Bible but in The Chosen, which is a line that I find easy to hear as truth, which is, if you don't have time for friends, you won't have any friends. And you can see that actually that Jesus in this moment of weeping is weeping over the loss of a friend.
Yeah.
As well as the bigger issue of death and how it has come into this situation. But it is this is the Son of God made human who is weeping over. Mm-hmm. So there's a real cost to him.
And the cross is the ultimate. Paul talks about how Greeks and Jews look at the cross and they see, the Greeks love a bit of wisdom and they see utter foolishness. Why would a man go to a cross and that be somehow the way that the whole of the universe is sorted out? I can't understand that. And then the Jews who love power, and I don't mean power and control, but power in terms of the power of God, demonstrated, and if you read the Old Testament, it's demonstrated all the time, have this guy that, see weakness, because actually God goes, the one who Paul is saying to them all, this is the God you've been waiting for, dies. And so there is this, at the center point of history, there is this event that is foolish and weak, and yet it is the event that turns the tables and everything else. It's as C.S. Lewis has Aslan say in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, that there is a deeper magic at work, that and Paul uses this phrase, when the powers and authorities, the strong men of this world take hold of Jesus and put him to death, that actually a deeper magic is at work, which is death cannot hold him. Yeah. And he rises to new life, defeating that power. And that the way that happens is through him being the servant king and through him being a in the world's eyes, a weak king. Yeah. And so this is where this idea that Tom Holland would say the victims and the vulnerable have agency, because actually God shows that the way through to his purposes are often, the way of the cross is the way of suffering, is the way of weakness, and it's the way of less of me and more of him. And that's what then changed. That's what Holland says. That's what creates a Western world in which we then go, well, we give agency to victims. We love a bit of vulnerability. Yeah. Does it make sense?
Yes. So essentially we are at the threshold of human emotion around weakness and vulnerability, and how what our worldview says about that in our reaction to it. And so we're kind of, Tom Holland has said, this is essentially, in his book Dominion, he says it's almost impossible to be in the West and to think of yourself as not Christian, because the worldview he would say is Christian. And I think we're driving at something underneath it, which is that in these moments there is a grating that goes on between that hypothesis that essentially the West is Christian in its culture, rather than Roman or Greek in its culture, because at the moment when a powerful person presents themselves as weak to us, we reject it. So there's a general kind of the irony being the welfare bill being the one that's being debated in the background. The fact that we can have a debate about welfare shows that there is a recognition of the vulnerable and their place within society. But then within that, there's this symbol of what we are trying to say in this moment actually exposes that we are more Greek and Roman than we would ever want to admit as a culture.
And as we move,
we might want to admit.
Yeah, kind of shifting into the tension in culture. The thing, I'm struggling to say this because I don't want to sound judgmental, but one of the reasons I think we culturally picked up on this Rachel Reeves moment and we're a bit like, not really happy about that, is because possibly, and the reason I'm saying possibly is because I don't know her, never met her, so I don't know what was going on for her in that moment, but it's quite possible that she was weeping because the welfare bill was going to fail, and these changes that were needed to make difference to people's lives, and she was thinking of people who would be affected. Or she was weeping because actually I've invested myself in this and this has failed, and actually my power is slipping away here. Yeah. And she could have been weeping for herself. Yeah. And because she could have been weeping for herself is why we kind of possibly as culture went, oh, don't like that. And the reason I'm kind of phrasing it like this is because I don't want to judge her, but there is this moment where we often kind of like, when stuff is exposed in our own hearts, we respond like that. Anger is one response, sorrow is another response, and sometimes there's stuff that comes up that actually we need to resolve because it's saying more about us than it is about a situation. And that leads us kind of to the tension, which is culture. Our culture cannot resolve this tension between weakness, vulnerability, authenticity, and the need for leadership. Our weakness, authenticity, vulnerability, and the need for kind of repentance and change and all that kind of thing. Because, and I found a quote from Carl Trueman that I'm going to get you to say because you loved it. If you can read my writing.
I can't read
Culture loves the fruit of faith,
but not the root
the root of faith. And so our culture loves so much. We talk about Christianity.
It's a good word, that one.
It's Carl Trueman, it's not me.
Culture loves the fruit of faith, but not the root of faith.
So I don't know Rachel Reeves, but I wonder if in that moment, a Christian would go, I've invested myself in this whole thing. This whole thing's falling apart. People are looking at me and they're thinking you're no good at your job and all that kind of thing. And actually, I would hope, if I was a Christian and Chancellor of the Exchequer, I am a Christian, would never be Chancellor of the Exchequer, that would be a place where you could be able to turn to prayer or turn to Christian brothers and sisters and say, I need prayer here, because actually there's stuff coming up in my heart about how I'm responding to failure in the world that is saying more about me. I need Jesus. And this is the problem, is that if we forget Jesus when these moments of weakness arise, whether they be last week's one, so I've lost a loved one, or this week's one, I failed.
Yeah.
If I've got nobody to go to, I have to try and fix either my grief at having lost a loved one or my other form of grief of having been exposed and not being good enough for what I do. I've got nobody to take it to.
I'm going to bring in a tangent here, Wayne.
Please do.
We've got two significant members of the royal family who've been through cancer in the last few years. In the King and his daughter, Princess of Wales. The way that they have suffered through cancer is something that we have essentially had to imagine onto the way in which they have done it, because they have done their suffering very privately. Yeah. Which is almost counter to the way that the culture now deals with those things. So if you think of You, Me and the Big C, the BBC podcast, I can't remember the name of the lady who was kind of the most prominent figure in that, who died, I think it was a couple of years ago now. But the way that we have culturally we've done pain, and this is another angle on the kind of the emotion. The way that we've done pain has been, we've learnt to do publicly. But here we've got people in positions of leadership, and actually they have been doing their pain privately. Where actually I think I would say that a gospel way of doing that as the leader of a nation would have been to have spoken from your pain and from your vulnerability to the nation about what it means to have travelled through that. So I think there's something about the culture of the way that we do pain, weakness, and emotion in this nation, and probably within the West, that backs that up from another angle. That actually we don't want the people in positions of power to tell us about their weakness.
This is why I quite like this podcast. If nobody listens, because actually we started and we were talking. I mean, I don't think we're going to get to imagery and idols, and that's fine because we started. We talked about like weakness, and so we don't know how to deal with pain when someone dies, but also we don't know how to deal with pain when you screw it up at work, which is essentially what Rachel Reeves has done. Yeah. You know, Keir Starmer has got one of the largest majorities going in history, and by all accounts, if there was an election tomorrow, he'd probably lose it heavily, and you can talk about sociological arguments and cultural shifts and all that kind of thing, but ultimately at the end of the day he'll be remembered as the guy for making a pig's ear out of his massive majority. And anybody who does a job and slightly screws it up or completely screws it up, even if circumstances are beyond their own control, and then says to you and tells you that they weren't bothered by that, I think is a liar. Because even the most redeemed spirit-filled person, because God has made us to do what we do and how well we're doing at what we do. And
we want to offer the best of ourselves back.
Yeah, but does also inhabit our well-being. And so we've got so this is another way of talking. Like Rachel Reeves probably I'm saying probably because I don't know her, so she might be a woman of faith, has no grid and no reference point for what happens when things go wrong and to whom do I turn.
Yeah.
Because she's sat on a bench with a whole bunch of people sat behind her who've rebelled against her,
Yeah.
and then a whole bunch of people sat opposite her who want her gone.
Yeah.
And are waiting, counting down like 4 years, and so she's all alone.
So the world that loves the fruit of faith but not the root of faith gets to this point where it's almost like it's got two pedals and it can only push one of them at the same time. So it wants vulnerability and honesty, but it also wants competence and force and dynamism, and it can't do the two simultaneously. And that's where we're heading with the root of faith, because we know ultimately that in Jesus we have the one whose act at the centre of it all is a place of vulnerability and weakness, but ultimately the true sign of force that speaks through the ages.
He stands at his friend's grave and he weeps. And he doesn't weep because it's the end. He weeps. He weeps because sorrow. He's sad that Lazarus has died. And Lazarus comes out of the grave, and he's probably weeping as well because he knows in his humanity that the only reason that Lazarus can come out of the grave is because he's going to go into the grave. And that's the thing that our culture lacks, is this idea that there is a God who has gone further into the pain that we experience for us and has come out the other side and has released a power through Pentecost that will bring transformation to even the greatest of pain and the greatest of failures. And that actually, again, if you're a Christian and you're sat there on the front seat, I keep looking at our pews here, imagine they're the front row of the House
Everyone's here, desperate to watch MTV Live.
But you would have an understanding, actually, that this, out of this defeat could come a victory, because you're wired into the bigger story where defeat leads to victory. And that's the thing that I think Truman and Tom Holland are pointing out that we have lost in the West, is we have lost the very foundation of how our whole society is held together, which is the sacrificial love of God. And then we're then trying to hang on to all of these fruit, but we've chopped the roots of the tree down.
So how do we live then as Christians, Wayne?
Well, you tell me. I think go on. We've got to be rooted in Jesus. That's the first point.
Oh, yeah. See what you did with your
thank you very
words
much.
there. Rooted in Jesus. Yeah, and that brings, you've written truth and compassion.
Yeah.
I think those two pedals that I was talking about, the kind of vulnerability and weakness and power and dynamism that the world wants but doesn't know how to bring simultaneously, is not somehow an equation that we can work out ourselves. It's actually a person.
Yeah.
And it's a relationship with a person. And it's a relationship with a person lived out in our lives. So it's not somehow that we can kind of put our feet down and balance them on the pedals, to how much do we press them at the right level? How can I get this right? How can I make sure that I'm sufficiently vulnerable to the people around me? And how can I make sure that there's enough power and dynamism in what I'm doing? No. It's about living in relationship with a person who was that, is that, and will always be that, who then lives that in and through us as we offer our lives to him.
Yeah. And then from there, I think living close to one another, because actually I think you need, if you are Rachel Reeves, you need somebody close to you to support you in your pain and in your grief, but then also challenge you if your pain and your grief is misplaced.
Yeah.
And I can't do that sat in a small church in Bristol, but nor can I do it if I'm a journalist at the Telegraph or the Guardian or whatever. But if I'm a friend, the Bible talks about the wounds of a friend. I'm able to sit in and go, what's going on here? And that's why, again, as church, we need one another, because we're able to speak into one another's lives. We're able to pray for one another. We're able to challenge one another when our grief and our pain is misplaced, and we're able to be God's work of healing in that, and in times when our pain and grief is well placed.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that's
and it's important to acknowledge, I think, that we can all, even when we know Jesus, we can all fall into this trap of overreaching ourselves and overstretching in terms of power and then finding ourselves swinging back the other way into a position of kind of total weakness and vulnerability. That's part of what it means for us to have disordered loves, for us to be human, for us to be broken. We all get it wrong. So this isn't, oh no, she's done a really bad thing. Actually, we've all been her. It's just that
we've all bitten from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. We're all hiding in the bushes, and we are all hoping nobody finds us. And then when something goes wrong, we suddenly think, oh no, I've been found out.
Exactly. So actually, all that's happened is that it's happened for her in a very public way. When actually, all of us have had the same thing happen to us at some point in our lives, whether it was when we were 5, 6, 7, or whatever. Like it's probably happened to most of us on a regular basis. The invitation of the God of truth and mercy is to come back to Him and to live a life that is rooted in Him in a way that shows people how detached this culture is from the root that is Jesus.
Yeah.